Look, here's the thing. We spent decades arguing about which diet is correct. Low fat, low carb, keto, plant-based, paleo, carnivore, right? Mediterranean, or whatever else comes next. And every one of those is a fight about a category. But almost none of them ask what the food is actually doing inside the cell. Because food isn't just fuel, it's raw material, it's information, and it changes the environment every single cell in your body has to operate in. Your enzymes, muscles, gut lining, immune system, all of those things require specific materials to do a specific job. And they respond differently depending on what you eat, how processed it is, and even when you eat. See, it's not just about calories and macronutrients, it's about the raw material your body builds itself out of and the information it uses to decide what to do next. So the real question was never which diet. It's whether the food showing up is supplying what your cells need to run, repair, and recover. So in this video, I'm going to give you the 10 principles that I would build around if I were trying to improve metabolic health, body composition, and long-term resilience. Hi, my name is Andrew Reed. I'm founder of MedGeeks. I trained as a physician assistant. I have a graduate degree in nutrition, have had over 100,000 patient and client visits in my career, and have taught the science of health and disease to over 10,000 clinicians. With that said, let's start with the mistake underneath almost every diet conversation. See, look, we keep counting calories and ignoring what those calories are actually made of. See, two meals can contain the same number of calories and create completely different biological effects. One can bring protein, magnesium, potassium, choline, B vitamin, zinc, fiber, omega-3 fats, and polyphenols. The other can bring plenty of energy with almost none of the material required to use that energy well. That's the first principle. Choose nutrient density over caloric density. Because you can have micronutrient insufficiency without meeting the classic textbook definition of being deficient. And insufficiency is enough to produce symptoms and dysfunction, especially when we're talking about the cellular level. Magnesium, for example, helps hundreds of enzymes do their jobs, and the ATP your cells use is normally bound to magnesium. B vitamins support pathways involved in methylation, neurotransmitters, and energy production. Choline helps build cell membranes and helps the liver export fat. Potassium helps maintain the electrical gradients across your cells, right? You can have enough of these nutrients to avoid a classic deficiency while still not having enough to support an expensive process like recovery. That gap matters, right? And this is why whole foods should be the default. Things like eggs, seafood, meat, legumes, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds, they're valuable because they deliver more biological material per calorie. Even the colorful compounds in plants do more than most people realize. Polyphenols from things like berries and leafy greens and cacao and green tea and coffee, olive oil, herbs, spices. We often call them antioxidants, but their more interesting job is signaling. They activate pathways like NRF2 that tell your cells to increase their own antioxidant and detoxification machinery. The food is not simply neutralizing every free radical for you. It's telling your body to become better at protecting itself. The second principle is to minimize ultra-processed food. And this is not only because it tends to contain more sugar, fat, or calories, right? There was an NIH metabolic ward study, and people were giving an ultra-processed food diet and then an unprocessed diet designed to be similar in calories and macronutrients. They could eat as much as they wanted. Now, on the ultra-processed diet, they spontaneously ate 500 more calories per day and gained weight. On the unprocessed diet, they lost weight. They were not instructed to overeat. The food changed their behavior. Ultra processed food is engineered to be eaten very, very quickly, right? It requires less chewing and keeps that reward system engaged while signals from your gut need time to catch up. By the time those signals arrive, the calories are already in. The starting ingredient is similar, but the metabolic event is not. So if you're overwhelmed by nutrition, just start there, right? Build most meals from foods that still resemble what they were and eliminate the liquid calories first. That one move will do more for you than deciding what diet to follow, right? Now, to be clear, There are specific diets that can definitely be used as interventions. Being intentional about the food can produce physiological and cellular changes that change the trajectory of not only symptoms, but multiple disease as well. Again, that just shows you how powerful food can actually can be when it's used with intention, right? Now, the third principle is adequate protein distributed across the day. The protein RDA is about 0.36 grams per pound, and it was never designed to optimize recovery, preserve muscle during weight loss, or overcome the anabolic resistance that comes with aging and chronic disease. For many adults, a more reasonable useful range is going to begin around zero point 0.7 grams per pound per day, and you can be higher depending on activity, age, goals, and medical context. But the daily total is only half the story. See, look, muscle protein synthesis behaves more like a switch than this running tally. It doesn't go up like that, it turns on and off. So you need enough of the essential amino acids, especially leucine, in one meal in order to flip that switch. And for many people, that means roughly 30, maybe up to 50 grams of high quality protein per meal. 10 grams at breakfast, 10 at lunch, and then having a giant steak dinner is not the same signal as reaching a meaningful dose 3 separate times at 3 separate meals. Also, truth be told, it's not even about protein. It's really about the amino acid composition. Not all protein has the same amino acid composition, and therefore won't behave the same once it's ingested into the body. Still, people like protein and using a gram of protein as a target because it's much easier to measure, understand, but just keep that nuance in mind, right? And muscle is not just about aesthetics. It's one of the largest places in your body that disposes of glucose, and it gives you the metabolic reserve during illness and aging. This becomes even more important during rapid weight loss, including weight loss on GLP-1 medications, for example. Now, if you lose a large amount of weight without enough protein and resistance training, some of that loss will be lean tissue. The scale moves in the right direction while your metabolic capacity moves in the wrong one. Now, the fourth principle, this is about managing glycemic variability. Most people think this only matters if they have diabetes. It doesn't. Hemoglobin A1C, for example, is an average. Averages hide swings. One person can spend the day with relatively narrow glucose range. Another can spike high after every meal and crash between them, right? So they can have the same A1C, but they have very different metabolic experiences. Repeated glucose spikes, they create substrate overload inside the mitochondria. This increases the oxidative stress, activating pathways involved in inflammation, glycation, endothelial dysfunction, and insulin resistance. Now, you don't need to remove every single carbohydrate in order to improve this, but you can do things like you can pair carbohydrates with protein and fat. You can eat vegetables, right, and protein before the starch instead of just starting with the bread or the rice. And place more of your carbohydrates around physical activities. When contracting muscle can actually pull the glucose out of the bloodstream with less dependence on insulin. Also, just like protein, not all carbohydrates are created equal. Carbohydrates from whole foods, right, are going to behave very differently when compared to carbohydrates from processed food. All right, the fifth principle. And the fifth principle is to optimize omega-3 status. I'm very bullish on omega-3. I feel it's incredibly underappreciated. We often talk about EPA and DHA like anti-inflammatory fats, right? But that description misses the more important idea. See, look, the resolution of inflammation is an active process. It's active. Your immune system doesn't just stop once the original threat that started the inflammation process is gone. It has to produce signals that turn off recruitment, clear debris, change macrophages from attack mode towards repair, and then rebuild tissue. Those signals include resolvins, protectins, meresins made from EPA and DHA, and without those raw materials, the body may struggle to complete the resolution program. So fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, herring provide EPA and DHA. The omega-3 index can measure your longer-term tissue status as it estimates the omega-3 status inside the red blood cell. The goal is not to take fish oil because the internet said it's healthy, right? The goal is to make sure that the machinery that resolves inflammation has the substrate that it needs. All right, the sixth principle, The sixth principle is microbiome supporting dietary diversity. All right, so I want to be careful here, right? I want to be careful with the word fiber. Fiber-rich foods can help support health in some, but it can actually harm others. And so, what I want to do instead is make the larger point. And the larger point is that the gut microbiome is incredibly important. Microorganisms in the gut produce metabolites that influence the intestinal barrier, immune signaling, glucose regulation, and host the energy metabolism, right? So there's evidence that the bacteria in the microbiome can communicate with the mitochondria through those metabolites, which is another axis in which they might be able to influence health and disease. This is why I'm focusing on microbiome supporting foods rather than treating all fiber as interchangeable. Look, animal research has shown that when certain gut bacteria are deprived of microbiota accessible carbohydrates, some of those can shift towards consuming the carbohydrates that are found in the protective mucus layer of the colon. In other words, when their preferred dietary substrates disappear, some organisms may begin using the barrier itself as a food source. Gut bacteria can also ferment certain fibers and resistant carbohydrates into short-chain fatty acids. Butyrate, butyrate is one of the major fuels used by healthy colonocytes. Those are the cells that are actually lining the colon and support several processes, right? That are involved in things like maintaining the intestinal barrier. When the barrier becomes impaired, intestinal permeability increases. This is what a lot of people refer to as leaky gut. Now, different foods provide different fibers, resistant starches, polyphenols that support different microbial functions. That can include things like fruits and vegetables, legumes, grains, whole grains, right? Nuts, seeds, herbs, even spices. So fermented foods is another category, and fermented foods with live cultures can add another layer by repeatedly exposing the gut to food-associated microorganisms. Now, those organisms don't necessarily colonize permanently all the time, but they can still influence the existing microbial community and its activity. All right, the seventh principle is going to be hydration. Now, even mild dehydration can affect attention, mood, exercise tolerance, kidney clearance, and the lab values, right, that we use to make decisions about your health, for example. Now, a practical starting point is going to be drinking about half an ounce of water per pound of body weight. And again, we need to adjust that for body composition, exercise, climate, diet, medical conditions, right? But water is one layer when it comes to hydration. Sodium, potassium, magnesium matter too. This is especially important if you eat a low carb diet, use a diuretic, sweat heavily, or maybe even take a GLP-1 medication. More water is not always the answer to fatigue, headaches, dizziness, or cramps, right? Sometimes the problem is that the water and the electrolytes are kind of out of balance. All right, the eighth principle is to align eating with circadian biology. Look, light sets the master clock in your brain. Food helps set the clocks in the peripheral tissues, such as the liver, the pancreas, the gut, and fat tissue. That means that when you eat is also information, right? Insulin sensitivity and glucose tolerance are generally better earlier in the active part of the day. Late night eating asks peripheral organs to process food, while the central clock up here is preparing for the body to go to rest. So for most people, the useful goal is not doing some extreme fasting protocol, right? It's eating at a reasonable schedule that is consistent. Front load more of your food earlier in the day and finish your last meal at least 3 hours before bed. The buffer gives glucose and insulin time to fall and gives the small intestine, some time in between meals to get this housekeeping system, and especially overnight. Now, that same logic argues against constant grazing or snacking, right? Every snack restarts digestion and triggers another insulin response. So, 3 satisfying meals often create a cleaner metabolic pattern, if you will, than eating 6 or 7 times, right? 7 meals spread across the day. That seems to work better. All right, the ninth principle here is to minimize or eliminate alcohol altogether. Look, for years, people were told that moderate drinking might protect the heart, right? Better research has challenged that story and really the methods behind it. Alcohol is a known human carcinogen. I think we can all agree that, right? It disrupts the gut barrier, it degrades sleep, it interferes with hormones, and it depletes nutrients like thiamine, folate, magnesium, and zinc. And at 7 calories per gram, it adds energy, but it doesn't provide satiety or any meaningful nutrition. Am I saying that having the occasional drink is going to derail your health? No, absolutely not. I believe it's more about what you do on most days that matters, not what you do every now and then. Still, it's a useful principle to know, right? If you're trying to recover from chronic dysfunction, alcohol is going to drain several of the same systems that you're working to refill. So it just makes it harder. All right, 10th principle here, last one. This is to reduce toxicant exposure through sourcing, storage, and preparation. Now, this is where people can become obsessive. So the goal is not necessarily perfection, right? It's to remove repeatable exposures when the costs and effort are reasonable. This one's personalized. This one's going to be very different for every single person. Just know, right? But for example, you can choose smaller fatty fish more often than these large predatory fish so that we can reduce mercury exposure, but we can still get EPA and DHA. We can avoid heating food in plastic because the heat is going to increase the movement of those compounds from the container into the food. We can use glass or stainless steel when practical. We can rotate using high heat or high heat cooking methods with things like steaming, poaching, braising, slow cooking, right? And don't let the fear of pesticides stop you from eating produce. If organic food fits your budget, go for it. If it doesn't, then healthy whole foods are still better than not eating the whole food, right? Although I believe that nutrition, right, these are the 10 principles. Now, I say all this, right? I believe that nutrition is incredibly important, but it's not the entire foundation, right? It's important, but it can't do all of the heavy lifting on its own. And now look, this is coming from someone who has a master's in personalized nutrition, a graduate certificate in precision nutrition, and I just finished my training in dietetics. I believe it's the piece that we should focus on first so that the rest of the foundation can be properly built. Still, movement matters, sleep matters, stress matters, community matters, feeling loved and safe matters, being outside matters, having purpose matters, right? A lot of things matter. But food is where an enormous part or an enormous amount of your capacity is either supplied or withheld. Every day, several times a day, for your entire life, right? It's not just about calories and macros, although they matter, but food gives your body signals and the raw supplies for every single repair it makes, every fire that it has to put out, every membrane it patches, right? So these are the 10 principles. I hope this shifts how you think about food. If it changed how you see your own situation, the next step is finding where your metabolic capacity actually stands. That's why I created a free metabolic capacity assessment. Click the link in the description to get it free. To better health, better science. See you on the next one. Take care. Bye.